Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by taking up an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. In India, medical stores are generally referred to as chemists and druggists. But henceforth, they will be known as pharmacies, and this change has been approved by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Because the term chemists and druggists is outdated and it has a negative connotation because generally the word drugs is associated with narcotics. So this is not a suitable term to refer to a professional pharmacist. So the industry has been demanding this change from a very long time, and recently the Drugs Technical Advisory Board has approved this demand and it has made the necessary changes by amending the corresponding rules based on the recommendations of the Drugs Consultative Committee. The Drugs Consultative Committee is a part of the Drugs Technical Advisory Board, and this institution comes under the Central Drugs Standards Control Organization, which is a part of the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So this change in terminology is in line with the international practice of referring to a medical shop as a pharmacy. This will provide a sense of identity and a sense of value to the pharmacist, and it will also give better recognition to the profession of pharmacy. So the Drugs Technical Advisory Board can be very important for prelims. So let us look at a few basic facts with regard to the DTAB. The Drugs Technical Advisory Board is the highest statutory decision-making body on the technical aspects related to drugs. And as I mentioned earlier, it is located under the Central Drug Standard Control Organization, which was discussed just a few days back, which in turn is located under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. And the DTAB has been established by the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940. Next, on page number 2, we have an advertisement which has been published by the Election Commission of India, which refers to the duties and responsibilities of a booth level officer. A booth level officer is a representative of the Election Commission at the grassroots level, and he plays a very crucial role in the updation of the voters list or the electoral roll. Generally, the Election Commission of India appoints one booth level officer for every polling station, and this will provide for a single line of accountability in order to ensure the updation of the voters list. This practice of appointing booth level officers was introduced by the Election Commission in 2006, and he is appointed as per the provisions of Section 13B, Clause 2 of the Representation of People's Act. According to this provision, a booth level officer can be appointed either from a government institution or from a semi-government institution or from a local body. Essentially, a booth level officer is someone who is well aware of the local issues and the local terrain. He is someone who can interact with the local community and as well as the representatives of the political parties at the grassroots level. So now let us look at the roles and responsibilities of the booth level officer. He is responsible for assisting eligible citizens to become voters and obtain the voter card. He should provide the required forms for addition, deletion and correction of electoral rolls, and he should also carry out the physical verification of the address which has been provided by the eligible voters. And based on his interaction with the local people and the representatives of the political parties, he should identify the voters who have shifted out of the constituency or those who have passed away and ensure that such names are promptly deleted from the voters list. This will ensure that the electoral rolls are updated and they are accurate. And he is also responsible for identifying persons with disabilities in the voters list, because based on this identification, the Election Commission will make appropriate provisions at the polling booth in order to ensure that elections are accessible to people with disabilities as well. And once a voter is registered on the list, he will be issued a photo identity card by the Election Commission, and the BLO is responsible for distributing these photo ID cards, and the booth level officer is also responsible for displaying the notices and notifications issued by the Election Commission, and he should read out the electoral rolls in front of the Gram Sabha and the Ward Sabhas. And once the elections are announced, the BLO is responsible for distributing the voter slips through which voters can identify their respective polling booths and their serial numbers. Generally, such voter slips are distributed by the respective political parties on the day of the election. You would have noticed that on the polling day, various political parties will set up their camps close to the polling booth, and they generally issue these voter slips to the voters. But the problem is, the voter slips issued by the political parties may not be entirely accurate. So hence the Election Commission deploys the booth level officer right outside the polling station, and he has to facilitate the voters and distribute the required voter slips to the respective voters. Next, we have an article on page 5 which refers to a study which was commissioned by the Union Water Resources Ministry in order to study the unique properties of the Ganga river. And this study has established that the Ganga has a higher proportion of antibacterial agents, which are also referred to as bacteriophages. And the components which have been derived through these bacteriophages, they hold great potential to produce an antibacterial drug in the pharmaceutical industry. This study was carried out by the National Environmental Engineering and Research Institute, which is one of the research labs under the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research. This in turn is located under the Department of Science and Technology, and the National Environmental Engineering and Research Institute is headquartered at Nagpur, and it conducts research primarily in the field of environmental science and engineering, and it mainly focuses on the impact of pollution, waste management, occupational diseases, etc. So as a part of this research, the national institution had studied the Ganga river, the Yamuna river and the Narmada river, and it was assessing the water quality for its radiological, microbiological and biological parameters. So this research has established that the Ganga river has a higher concentration of bacteriophages as compared to the Yamuna and the Narmada, and especially the higher reaches of the Himalayan mountains, that is where the Bhagirathi river flows, a higher concentration of antibacterial agents has been noted. The Bhagirathi river is one of the source rivers of the river Ganga, and samples which were collected in this region have shown that the Ganga river has nearly 3 times the antibacterial agents as compared to the Yamuna and the Narmada. These bacteriophages, they are nothing but a type of virus which can kill bacteria, and a further research conducted by IIT Roorkee has isolated the lysine gene from these bacteriophages. Through this lysine gene, the lysine protein can be obtained, and this holds great potential to produce antibacterial drugs in the pharmaceutical industry. Next, we have an article on page 5 which refers to the directions which have been issued by India's foreign minister to the Indians who have been stuck in Libya. India's foreign minister Sushma Swaraj has asked the 500 Indians who have been stuck in Tripoli to immediately evacuate and head back to India because of the deteriorating security situation in Libya. Over the last few weeks, Libya has been going through a crisis again. The rebel military commander Khalifa Haftar has launched an assault against the Libyan government, which is headed by Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj. The Libyan government, which has the backing of the United Nations, was installed in order to restore normalcy to Libya after the civil war which followed the Arab Spring of 2011. Until 2011, Libya was ruled by an autocratic dictator by the name Muammar Gaddafi. He was overthrown from power during the revolutionary Arab Spring movement, which spread across Middle Eastern and North African countries in the year 2011. Inspired by the uprising of democratic protesters in Tunisia and in Egypt, Libya also witnessed democratic protests against the autocratic rule of Gaddafi, and this situation was exploited by the Western countries led by United States, the United Kingdom and France, and they carried out airstrikes against the armed forces of Gaddafi in order to assist the protests against the dictator. So this conflict plunged Libya into a civil war, and it threatened thousands of Indian nationals who are employed in Libya. So during this crisis in 2011, India had carried out a major evacuation of the Indians who were stuck in the conflict zone, and it had also imposed a travel ban to Libya. But despite this ban, there are around 500 Indians who still remain in Tripoli, and the foreign minister has asked them to return immediately. Otherwise, the Indian government will not be in a position to evacuate them if the fresh crisis escalates into a major conflict. So after Gaddafi was overthrown, he was killed by the protesters, and the country had plunged into a civil war, and normalcy was restored very recently by setting up a civilian government under Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj. This Libyan government had the backing of the United Nations and the Western countries, but right now, rebel military commander Khalifa Haftar has launched an assault against the Libyan government in order to recapture power. So this topic can be very important for international relations under GS paper 2, and it can be important for prelims as well, because India has carried out many such evacuation missions from conflict zones. The Indian diaspora is very well spread out in the Middle Eastern and North African countries. They work in a variety of sectors, and they send back crucial remittances back to India. But most of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, they are extremely volatile, and every time a country plunges into a civil war or into a conflict, it will threaten the well-being of the Indian diaspora. So it becomes the responsibility of the Indian government to provide for timely evacuation. So this will require great coordination between the Ministry of External Affairs and the Indian Navy and the Indian Air Force, and as well as the Research and Analysis Wing and Air India. These institutions have to work together to arrange the massive logistics which are required to provide for a safe passage to Indian nationals who are stuck in such conflict zones. India has successfully executed many such operations in the past, and these missions can be asked in prelims. So let's quickly look at the massive evacuations that India has carried out from active conflict zones. We have Operation Safe Coming, which was executed by the Indian Navy and the Indian Air Force in assistance with the Ministry of External Affairs in 2011 in order to evacuate Indian nationals who were stuck in Libya during the Arab Spring. Then we had Operation Sukoon to evacuate Indian nationals during the Lebanon War of 2006. More recently, Operation Rahat was conducted to evacuate Indians who were stuck in the Yemen civil war in 2015. Then we also have the massive airlift which was carried out from Kuwait during the Gulf War of 1990. All these evacuation operations can be very important for prelims. Now let us take up a column from the editorial page. The column written by Akbar Zaidi provides for an evaluation of the economic crisis in Pakistan, and it evaluates the options available to Pakistan with regard to accepting the assistance from the International Monetary Fund. First, the writer provides for an evaluation of Pakistan's economy. The writer says that Pakistan's economy has been in a free fall over the last 8 months, and he holds Prime Minister Imran Khan and his party Tehreek-e-Insaf, which has formed the government in Pakistan, to be entirely responsible for this economic crisis. Because since forming the government, the Prime Minister and his cabinet have mismanaged the economy and have displayed great incompetence, and as a result, the Pakistani economy has fallen into a further crisis. If you look at the inflation in Pakistan, it is currently at a very dangerous level of 9.4%. This is the highest rate of inflation which has been witnessed in the last 5.5 years. and it is expected that inflation in Pakistan will cross the double digits very soon. And the Pakistani currency, which is the Pakistani rupee, continues to lose value consistently, and as a result, the cost of imports, especially oil, has gone up. And this increase in the cost of imports, especially oil, has put a lot of strain on the country's current account deficit, and the fiscal deficit of Pakistan is more than 6% of its GDP. Despite having such poor indicators of economic performance, Pakistan has not been able to cut down on its expenses, especially its defense expenditure has been consistently going up on the account of national security, and its interest payments have also been increasing. So due to the scale of this economic crisis, Pakistan can approach the International Monetary Fund and seek a financial assistance. The IMF functions as a contingency fund for countries which are going through an economic crisis, but the problem is any assistance given by the IMF is highly conditional. For example, even India went through a massive economic crisis in 1991, which is known as the BOP crisis or the balance of payments crisis. So when India approached the IMF for assistance, it imposed a few conditions on the Indian government, and it asked India to devalue its currency and open up its markets and introduce economic reforms. So if a country accepts these conditions as a part of an economic bailout, then it will definitely impose severe hardship, especially on the citizens. And during the elections, Imran Khan had clearly said that Pakistan would never approach the IMF because of these stringent conditions. Instead, Imran Khan had relied on the crucial allies of Pakistan to come to its assistance. Over the last 8 months, the Pakistani government has got some sort of financial assistance from China, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. But the assistance given by these countries is not sufficient to overcome the crisis, and Pakistan needs to approach the IMF in order to stabilize its economy. Since the Imran Khan government had refused to approach the IMF over the last 8 months, Pakistan had devalued its currency on its own by more than 35% in order to stabilize its economic performance. But despite such a massive devaluation in its currency value, its exports have still remained stagnant. So as a result, the GDP growth of Pakistan has been severely affected, and according to the Pakistani government, the country is expected to grow at 3.5% this fiscal year. But the World Bank and the IMF have a different perception of GDP growth. According to these two institutions, Pakistan's GDP growth will not be more than 2.9% for this fiscal year. So the writer holds the Imran Khan government to be completely responsible for this financial mess, and he says that the economy of Pakistan has been mismanaged and the Imran Khan government is incompetent to address these structural issues. Next, we have an editorial on page 6 which evaluates the draft Indian Forest Act which has been proposed. The Indian Forest Act was introduced in 1927, and it is a colonial era law which was designed to protect the commercial interests of the colonial empire, and its main focus was on the extraction of forest resources. And as a result, the Indian Forest Act of 1927 had deprived the tribal communities, the Adivasis and traditional forest dwellers, of their traditional rights in the forest areas. So if a post-independence government is trying to reform the colonial law, then the expectation would be that the draft law would provide for expansion of forests and protection of the biodiversity present in the forest areas, and it should also provide for ensuring the well-being of the tribal communities and the traditional forest dwellers. Because such a legislation would recognize the connection between traditional forest dwellers and the forest areas. Most of the tribal communities would have resided in the forest areas for centuries together. They would rely on the extraction of minor forest produce, and in return, they would play an active role in conserving the forests and the biodiversity. So if such an approach is followed, it would provide for scientific and community-led conservation model. Through such a model, the government institutions and the NGOs, they can assist the tribal communities to actively take part in the conservation efforts. But unfortunately, the draft law which has been proposed abandons this approach, and instead it has taken up a bureaucratic approach. Because the main focus of the draft Indian Forest Act is on establishing bureaucratic control over India's forest areas. This is an alarming development because if you look at the state of forests in India, there is an urgent need to provide for the expansion of forest areas. For example, if you look at the statistics which have been brought out by the State of India Forest Report of 2017, it says that hardly around 2.99% of India's geographical area is covered with very dense forests. And another 21.54% of India's geographical area is covered with open forests and moderately dense forests. So as you can see, the quality of forest cover in India is not so great, and due to the expansion of industrial activities and large-scale construction, the forest cover and its quality is depleting over the years. And at the same time, the government is slowly snatching away the traditional rights enjoyed by the tribals, Adivasis and traditional forest dwellers. So this will not only affect their well-being, but it will also affect their ability to conserve India's forests and biodiversity. This is where the editorial criticizes some of the provisions of the draft bill. The most controversial provision is the provision which provides for immunity to forest officials, and it empowers them to use weapons in order to prevent a forest offense. So the editorial feels that this is a hardline approach which is being adopted by the government, and such a policing approach will only result in the violation of human rights, and it will create a further divide between the forest department and the tribal communities. And the draft bill also contains provisions to deny access to forest areas for the local population, and this goes against the spirit of the Forest Rights Act and the egalitarian principles which were enshrined in the Forest Rights Act, because the FRA had recognized the traditional rights of the forest dwelling communities, and it had recognized the crucial role that the tribal communities can play in conservation of forests and biodiversity. So the draft Indian Forest Act makes a complete departure from this. So the editorial concludes by saying that the government should have a relook at the draft bill, and it should consult with all the stakeholders before finalizing the Indian Forest Act. So essentially, the central government should engage with the state governments, the civil society and NGOs, and as well as with the conservation groups and scientific institutions. Now let us take up the practice questions. Which of the following is not the responsibilities of a booth level officer? A. Updating electoral rolls. B. Distributing voter slips. C. Enforcing the model code of conduct. D. Identifying voters with disabilities under his jurisdiction. The correct answer is option C. It is not the responsibility of a booth level officer to enforce the model code of conduct. Now let us take up the second question. Which of the following statements are incorrect with regard to measles? It is a highly contagious infectious disease. It is caused by the measles virus. It is an airborne disease. All the three statements are correct. So option D is the right answer, because none of the statements are incorrect. Now let us take up the third practice question. INS Kolkata, which is recently seen in news, is a stealth guided missile destroyer. So option A is the right answer. Now let us take up a map based question. The Bhagirathi river flows through which of the following states before joining the Ganga river? Is it Himachal Pradesh or Uttar Pradesh or Uttarakhand or none of the above? The correct answer is option C. It flows through Uttarakhand before it joins the Ganga river. Now let us take up a question from a previous year's prelims paper. Which one of the following issues the Global Economic Prospects report periodically? Is it the Asian Development Bank, or the EBRD, or the US Federal Reserve, or the World Bank? The correct answer is option D, the World Bank. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.